when, after a detailed review of Nazi achievements, Hitler cries, "My life's fight has not been in vain."
What if the final words of one of Hitler's most trusted generals shattered a tradition that had stood for centuries? When Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus broke his silence before death, his confession stunned historians, outraged veterans, and left the world questioning everything they thought they knew about honor and obedience in war. The last thing anyone expected him to say is exactly what shook history forever, and you won't believe it. A confession that echoed through history. "I have no intention of ending myself for that bohemian corporal." These were the sharp and almost defiant words Friedrich Paulus spoke near the end of his life. With this statement, he not only rejected Adolf Hitler's unspoken demand that he take his own life, but also shattered a long tradition within the German military. No German field marshal had ever surrendered alive. By refusing to die in Stalingrad, and later openly explaining why, Paulus changed the image of what a commander's duty meant in wartime. The symbolic weight of his words was enormous. For generations, German officers were expected to embody loyalty and sacrifice to the very end. Hitler himself promoted Paulus to Field Marshal in January 1943, fully expecting him to commit self-injury rather than fall into Soviet hands. Instead, Paulus surrendered, telling those around him that his faith and his conscience would not allow him to take his own life. His rejection of that grim expectation was a turning point, not just in his personal story, but also in the way many Germans and historians later judged him. Reactions to his confession have been deeply divided. In East Germany, where Paulus spent his final years, the government presented him as a man who had broken free from Hitler's poisonous grip. His later cooperation with Soviet authorities and his role in anti-Nazi organizations were used to paint him as a figure of redemption. In this version of history, he was the general who saw through the lies, rejected blind loyalty, and urged others to stop fighting a doomed and destructive war. The West, however, viewed him very differently. Many veterans and observers saw his refusal to fight to the death as cowardice. To them, Paulus was a man who had followed orders blindly during the height of the war, but found courage only when it was too late. They believed he should have either saved his men earlier by disobeying Hitler or shared their fate completely. For these critics, his final words revealed not bravery, but weakness and self-preservation. This clash of perspectives makes Paulus such a controversial figure even today. Some historians argue that his decision not to end himself showed strength because he valued life over blind tradition. Others claim it showed the limits of his character, a final act that reflected caution rather than true defiance. But rewind and see how a man, born to modest circumstances and trained in silence and discipline, ended up in such a fraught spotlight. Roots of discipline. Friedrich Paulus was born on the 23rd of September 1890 in Guckhagen, also known as Breitenau, in the German state of Hesse-Nassau. His father worked as a treasurer or lower civil servant, and his mother came from modest farming roots. The family lived a quiet and structured life, and these surroundings shaped young Paulus into a boy who valued order and discipline. Nothing in his early years suggested that he would one day command one of the largest armies in history, yet the traits that defined him in childhood quietly prepared him for a life in uniform. As a young man, Paulus dreamed of joining the German Navy. The idea of life at sea, with its strict codes of conduct and disciplined environment, appealed to him. But this dream was short-lived. He was rejected as a naval cadet, partly because he was not from an aristocratic background, and partly due to health issues. This rejection was a disappointment, but it redirected him to another path, the army. Before fully committing to military life, Paulus briefly studied law at Marburg University. His time there was short, and in February 1910, he left his studies to enlist in the army. At 19 years old, he entered the 111th Infantry Regiment as an officer cadet. From the start, he was not a fiery or charismatic figure. Instead, he stood out for his careful nature. A 1927 assessment described him as slow but very methodical, and noted his skill in tactics, though he often took too long in decision-making. He was also known for avoiding conflict with others, preferring diplomacy over confrontation. In his personal life, Paulus gained a strong partner who would give him social recognition. On the 4th of July 1912, he married Elena Rosetti Sulescu, a Romanian woman of noble descent. Their marriage elevated his standing in society and provided him with stability throughout his career. Elena's grace and connections gave Paulus a confidence that his modest family background could not. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Paulus did not serve as a frontline commander. Instead, he worked in staff, supply, and logistics positions in places such as Macedonia and France. While others sought glory in the trenches, Paulus built his reputation behind the lines. By the end of the war, Paulus was seen as a cautious but reliable officer, a man who thrived in structure rather than in bold acts. These qualities would define him for decades to come. This disciplined, cautious officer would soon find himself navigating the simmering ambitions of the Reichswehr and the looming rise of Nazism. From the Versailles Army to the Nazi war machine. When the First World War ended in 1918, Germany faced humiliation and harsh restrictions under the Treaty of Versailles. The once mighty army was cut down to just 100,000 men, and only 4,000 officers were allowed to remain. Many promising soldiers saw their careers end, but Friedrich Paulus survived the cuts. His reputation for order, discipline, and quiet reliability ensured his place in the shrunken Reichswehr. This survival gave him the chance to slowly rise during one of the most turbulent decades in German history. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, Paulus worked in various staff roles. These years were not filled with dramatic battles or rapid promotions, but with steady service and training assignments. He developed a reputation as a man who paid attention to detail, followed rules carefully, and could be trusted with responsibility. He was not charismatic or outspoken, but in an unstable political climate, his professional neutrality became an advantage. He kept away from politics and devoted himself to military organization, making him useful no matter who held power. In 1935, with Germany secretly rearming under Hitler, Paulus was promoted to Chief of Staff of the Panzer Troop Command under General Oswald Lutz. This role placed him at the center of the development of Germany's new armored forces. Though not a frontline innovator like Heinz Guderian, Paulus contributed to the planning and structuring of panzer operations, helping to lay the foundations of modern mechanized warfare. By 1938, Paulus had become Chief of Staff to Guderian's 16th Motorized Corps. Guderian respected his intelligence and organizational ability, but questioned his decisiveness in critical moments. This tension between brilliance and hesitation would follow Paulus for the rest of his career. He was admired for his careful mind, but doubted when bold action was required. When the Second World War began, Paulus was a key figure in planning and execution. He served as Chief of Staff during the invasion of Poland in 1939 and was involved in organizing the swift campaigns in Belgium and France in 1940. These victories showed the effectiveness of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics, and Paulus's role in planning further cemented his reputation as a capable but cautious officer. Others, however, remained skeptical of his leadership qualities. Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant strategists, later described him as a very clever man, though perhaps not a very strong character. Paulus himself once remarked on the nature of soldiers. They fight, carrying out their duty, not thinking about the reasons, true to their military oath. And the beginning and the end of war is the business of politicians. His words reflected his deep sense of obedience and loyalty to duty. When the Wehrmacht turned eastward into Russia, his cautious approach would collide with Hitler's hubris, and the stage was set for his greatest test: the Hell of Stalingrad. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, it marked the largest invasion in history. Millions of men poured into Soviet territory, and Friedrich Paulus, working within the General Staff, was deeply involved in the planning of this campaign. The early months seemed to promise success as German forces advanced rapidly, but by the end of the year, the limits of supply and the ferocity of Soviet resistance were becoming clear. It was within this brutal struggle that Paulus would soon be given his own command and the most fateful responsibility of his career. In early 1942, Paulus was appointed commander of the Sixth Army. His task was part of Hitler's ambitious summer offensive, known as Case Blue, which aimed to capture the oil-rich Caucasus region and secure Stalingrad, the city on the Volga River that carried Stalin's name. The assignment was prestigious but also perilous. The Sixth Army was one of the largest and most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht, with more than 250,000 men under its command. At first, Paulus's army advanced with speed, driving deep into Soviet territory. Yet the deeper they went, the longer their supply lines stretched. Ammunition, food, and fuel became harder to deliver. Harsh terrain, poor infrastructure, and the sheer vastness of Russia made every mile more difficult. By the time the Sixth Army reached Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the men were already strained. The fighting inside the city quickly descended into a nightmare. Stalingrad was not just another objective, it was a symbolic prize that Hitler was determined to take at all costs. The Soviets, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, fought with relentless determination. Street by street, building by building, even room by room, the battle raged. Factories, sewers, and apartment blocks became fortresses. Soldiers clung to every position, often supported by civilians who refused to surrender their homes. As the months dragged on, Paulus saw his men ground down in endless combat. Winter descended, and conditions grew unbearable. Hitler refused every request to withdraw, or even to reposition the Sixth Army to safer ground. For him, Stalingrad was not just a military objective, but a matter of prestige. Paulus, bound by his deep sense of obedience, continued to carry out his orders, though his private communications revealed the desperation of the situation. On 24 January 1943, as the Soviet ring tightened around Stalingrad, Paulus sent a stark message to headquarters: 18,000 wounded, without the slightest aid of bandages and medicines. In another dispatch he reported, troops without ammunition or food. Effective command no longer possible. 18,000 wounded without any supplies or dressings or medicines. Further defense senseless. His words revealed the collapse of both his army and his authority. Trapped deep in enemy territory, Paulus would soon face the most harrowing command decision of his life: encirclement, desperation, and the road to surrender. By November 1942, the tide at Stalingrad had turned. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that smashed through the weaker Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the German flanks. Within days, the once mighty Sixth Army and parts of the Fourth Army were surrounded. Nearly 250,000 Axis troops were trapped in what became known as the Stalingrad Cauldron, or Kessel. What had begun as a bold German advance now turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Inside the pocket, Paulus's men faced a worsening nightmare. Supplies of food, ammunition, and fuel were cut off, and the Luftwaffe could not deliver enough by air to sustain such a large force. Soldiers faced the bitter Russian winter with little more than rags for clothing. Frostbite, starvation, and disease spread rapidly. The men fought on, but each day their strength and morale declined. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, tried to mount a relief operation from outside the encirclement. Yet Hitler refused to let Paulus attempt a breakout. The Führer ordered the Sixth Army to hold its ground, insisting that Stalingrad had to be defended to the last man. Hitler also rejected multiple Soviet offers of surrender, which promised humane treatment, preserved uniforms, and even eventual return of the troops. For Paulus, the orders from above were clear: resist, regardless of cost. As conditions collapsed, Paulus pleaded with Berlin. On the 22nd of January 1943, he sent a desperate message saying he had lost control of his men. He explained that the army was without ammunition or food, with thousands of wounded dying without supplies or medicines. He urged Hitler to allow surrender. The reply was firm: no capitulation. The end came quickly after that. On the 30th of January, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. No German officer of that rank had ever been captured alive, and the unspoken command was obvious: self-injury. Paulus, however, chose another path. The next day, with his headquarters surrounded by Soviet troops, he surrendered.
Threatened the families of his own soldiers with death if one man should surrender.
By the 2nd of February, the last remnants of the Sixth Army laid down their arms. When questioned about his refusal to die, Paulus explained his reasoning with words that would echo through history: "I have no intention of ending myself for that Bohemian corporal." Even in Soviet captivity, he resisted pressure to order other German units to surrender, saying that as a captured officer, he had no authority to do so. Captured and pressured, Paulus's next chapter would be one of ideological transformation or pragmatism under duress. Captivity, collaboration, and the politics of redemption. When Friedrich Paulus was first taken into Soviet custody in early 1943, he tried to keep his distance. He made it clear that he considered himself a prisoner of war, not a traitor, and at first avoided involvement in Soviet propaganda efforts. For months, he maintained the stance of a silent soldier, unwilling to speak against Germany, even as he witnessed the suffering caused by Hitler's decisions. That changed after the failed attempt to assassinate Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944. By then, Paulus had seen enough destruction and hopelessness to convince him that the war could only end in catastrophe if it continued. He broke his silence and joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization made up of German officers and prisoners who urged their countrymen to lay down their arms. From captivity, Paulus appealed to fellow officers to abandon Hitler and save what remained of Germany from ruin. This decision would forever shape how history judged him. Back in Germany, his cooperation with the Soviets did not go unnoticed. The Nazi regime retaliated through the policy of Sippenhaft, or clan liability. Paulus's wife, Elena, and their daughter were placed under surveillance and pressure as punishment for his betrayal. While he survived in captivity, his family bore the heavy cost of his choices. After the war, Paulus was brought to Nuremberg, where he testified as a witness for the Soviet prosecution. His testimony provided insights into the planning of the war against the Soviet Union and the inner workings of the German High Command. During questioning, he was pressed about a letter he had sent to the Soviets that focused only on Russian civilians and prisoners of war, not German soldiers. Paulus explained that the letter had been written in response to specific Soviet concerns, not as a general statement. He also admitted that by 20 January 1943, he had already reported that the situation in Stalingrad was beyond human endurance, with cold, hunger, and epidemics making further defense impossible. In 1953, the Soviet Union allowed Paulus to move to East Germany. There he was welcomed as a man who had broken with Hitler. He became the head of the Civilian Military History Research Institute in Dresden, gave lectures on foreign policy, and supported calls for German reunification. He criticized the Nazi regime openly, but also voiced skepticism toward certain Western policies, aligning himself with the Soviet-backed state that now sheltered him. But in those final years of illness and introspection, what did he believe, regret, or conceal? Illness, final words, and ambiguous legacy. In late 1956, Friedrich Paulus's health began to fail. Doctors diagnosed him with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a degenerative disease that gradually weakened his body. By the start of 1957, he was bedridden in Dresden, struggling with illness that slowly stripped away his strength. On the 1st of February 1957, at the age of 66, he died quietly in an East German hospital. Even in death, his story carried symbolic weight. Though he had lived his final years in East Germany under Soviet influence, Paulus's will requested that he be buried in Baden-Baden, West Germany, beside his wife, Elena. The decision highlighted the contradictions of his life, caught between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The words he spoke in his last days continued to echo through history. "I have no intention of ending myself for that bohemian corporal." For some, these words showed quiet defiance, a refusal to follow Hitler into destruction. For others, they symbolized cowardice, the unwillingness of a man to share the fate of his soldiers. Still others saw them as an act of pragmatism, proof that Paulus valued life over blind tradition. East Germany shaped his legacy to fit its narrative, presenting him as a redeemed figure who had broken with Hitler and turned toward socialism. In West Germany, however, many veterans regarded him as dishonorable, accusing him of abandoning his men and lacking courage. What are your thoughts on Friedrich Paulus's last confessions? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe for more content.